This is Recovery People, Volume 1. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Heath Riddles. Recovery People is a weekly podcast about the culture of recovery from substance abuse and other forms of addiction. Check us out on the web at RecoveryPeople.org. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest from the front lines. Today on Recovery People, Faces and Voices of Recovery. It's one of the most progressive organizations in America advocating for people struggling with addiction. We'll talk to Program Director Tom Hill about his vision for doing away with the stigma around addiction once and for all. Also on today's show, it's hard enough accessing recovery resources these days under the best of circumstances. But imagine trying to navigate the journey without the ability to hear. We'll talk to one woman who is leading the effort to bring 12-step meetings to the deaf and hard of hearing community in Austin, Texas. All that and more straight ahead on this, the inaugural edition of Recovery People. Stay with us. Let's face it, recovery has a PR problem in America. Things have certainly changed for the better over the years, but the stigma associated with addiction is still one of the major barriers to accessing the life-saving support resources available in recovery. The state and federal governments spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year addressing the issue, and one organization is dedicated to making sure that people in and around recovery have a seat at that table. Faces and Voices in Recovery was created to organize the millions of Americans affected by addiction to speak with one voice. The organization works to change public perceptions of recovery, promote effective public policy, and demonstrate that recovery is working for millions of Americans. Their mission? To bring the power and proof of recovery to everyone in the nation. Tom Hill is the program director of Faces and Voices in Recovery. He's a founding board member of the organization with more than 20 years of personal recovery and community organizing experience. We spoke with him recently about his work with the organization.
Tom Hill, welcome to Recovery People. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Heath. My pleasure.
Tom, can you start out just by sort of telling us a little bit about what Faces and Voices of Recovery, also known as FAVOR, what it is and sort of how it came to be?
Well, we don't use the acronym FAVOR just because we don't do favors for anybody, so we use Faces and Voices for short.
Faces and Voices, gotcha.
Faces and Voices of Recovery, it's an organization about 10 years old. It's an advocacy organization for people in recovery, family members, and allies, and we advocate with and for the 20 million people in addiction recovery in the United States, and advocate for the 23 million people that have substance issues and problems that may or may not be on the road to recovery.
So, over 50 million people in this country who are dealing with issues around addiction and recovery.
Correct.
And I guess really more specifically, my question is, I'm wondering kind of what specific need is Faces and Voices filling in the country? What wasn't being done or addressed before that your organization kind of coalesced around and decided, look, we need to get this done?
Well, we do a lot of public education on the realities of not only addiction, but even more importantly, the realities of recovery in this country. That's the part of putting the face and voice to recovery, because recovery's been sort of the best kept secret up until recent years. We also, work on affecting positive public policies and programs, as well as addressing negative, stigmatizing, and discriminatory public policies that act as barriers to keep people from getting the recovery they deserve.
So it's really about sort of, if I'm not mistaken, what you're talking about is sort of bringing a more public, and I might even say a federal sort of attention around these issues to the table. Is that right?
Well, I would say, it's federal, it's state, it's municipal, it's regional, it's on all levels of government, society, commerce, everything that there are those of us that are in recovery in all ranks of society and all professions that are living, active, healthy lives, and And people deserve to know about that. People always hear about the dark side of addiction in this country, but they don't hear about the millions of people that are living active lives in recovery.
You said something really interesting. You said up until a few years ago, recovery was sort of the best kept secret. What do you mean by that? When did things start to change, and what changed, and what is changing?
Well, I think that there's always been waves of change, but I think the change really took hold in the 90s, and more specifically in the late 90s, around the turn of the century or the new millennium, where folks started, talking about organizing and developing an organized recovery community, or a set of recovery communities where folks were out loud and proud about their recovery status, and that there was a real shift, I would say, around 1998, 1999, when that first started happening. And in the course of the years since then, I've noticed a huge change of the amount of people willing to talk about their recovery publicly and disclose their recovery status.
Which I think brings up an interesting point, and really kind of the crux of what I think is really fascinating about what you guys are doing. I know that, for most of our listeners, the 12 steps and the 12 traditions are, old news. We're very familiar with them, and sort of how sacred they hold the idea of anonymity and the concept of attraction rather than promotion. Some of our listeners may be not so familiar with the 12-step approach. So could you sort of just explain those concepts, first of all? And then I really want to hear about how your organization sort of reconciles those ideas with your advocacy work, which on the surface could seem contradictory.
Well, they may on the surface seem that way, but when you really think about it and drill down, they're not really contradictory. So, we have a message training about how to tell your story publicly and appropriately, and how to introduce yourself. So, I would start by saying, my name is Tom Hill, and I'm a person in long-term recovery. And for me, that means that I haven't had a drink or drug in close to 20 years, coming this June of 2012. And that I have even more time in recovery as a family member of an alcoholic and addictive family. So, so I've told you about myself. I've told you that I've had continuous sobriety for almost 20 years, but I haven't made any mention about my membership or non-membership in any 12-step or other kind of program.
Right.
So I've kept and I'm not telling you that now. So if I am in fact a member of AA or NA, which I'm not telling you, but if I was, I'm keeping my anonymity in that program and as a member of that program and that fellowship, separate from disclosing my recovery status.
And so when an organization like Faces and Voices talks about recovery and the recovery movement with quotes around it, you're talking about a much broader umbrella than what a lot of people outside and even inside recovery might think about when we hear that word. So what are you talking about when you say recovery or the recovery movement?
Yeah, well, we always talk about honoring all pathways to recovery. So the 12 steps is certainly a viable and even a dominant way of a pathway to recovery. But there's a lot of others, including a lot of faith-based and church programs that help people recover, medication-assisted recovery, even things that there are non-12-step groups that are mutual aid, like Smart Recovery and Women in Recovery. And then there's folks who just do it on their own. So there's lots of different ways that people sort of achieve their own recovery, and we sort of encompass all of that.
Right. In my research for this article, I talked to a lot of other sort of thought leaders in this recovery movement. One thing I remember hearing that really stuck out is that Faces and Voices is the smart kid in the room whenever recovery comes up. What does that mean to you
I missed that statement. I'm sorry.
I was saying, I'll just repeat the question. In my research for this article, I talked to a lot of other, like you, thought leaders in this recovery movement. And one thing I remember hearing that really stuck out is that Faces and Voices is a so-called smart kid in the room whenever recovery comes up. And I'm interested to hear what that means to you to be the smart kid in the room when this topic comes up, and the responsibility behind being on such the cutting edge of this movement.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I love smart people, and I love people who think I'm smart. But the bottom line is, it's really, the stuff we're doing is really commonsensical, I think. You know, it's a lot of folks who use and have substance use problems and addiction are folks that are that have come up against trouble or have a troubled past, or that they're not bad people. And they deserve better than the sort of attitudes they're given in this society. But I guess, but more importantly, it's part of it is, and I'm going to throw this out for people in 12-step programs, is to know your history, and know where those traditions came from, and know the sources of those anonymity traditions, and also know that Bill Wilson, in many cases, was public about his recovery, talked to
the founder
Congress
of
about
AA.
that, and he also sponsored a woman named Marty Mann, who was a huge advocate. She was also a lesbian, not out at the time because it was difficult to be an out lesbian in the 40s and 50s, but it was also hard to be a woman in recovery or a woman alcoholic during those years also. But she was a huge champion for public education about alcoholism, and they found ways to talk about their recovery without jeopardizing their anonymity status in the program. So there's a really rich history of that in NA and in AA and in NA. Sorry.
And Bill Wilson, for listeners who may not know, is credited with founding AA and wrote the big book and all that stuff.
And Bill Wilson was Marty Mann's sponsor.
Right.
So there's a lot. They even understood the necessity for not only keeping AA intact through anonymity and addressing the stigma in that way, but also that the public needed to know and have their ignorance challenged around alcoholism and ultimately addiction.
In case you're just joining us, our guest is Tom Hill. He is the program director of Faces and Voices in Recovery, a national organization which advocates for people in recovery as well as our friends and families.
Another really interesting thing to me that you just brought up is your work specifically with the LGBT community in recovery, which I know you've done a lot of. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of the contributing factors to the disease of addiction, as well as maybe some of the barriers to recovery that are unique to the LGBT community.
Well, I started a group at the LGBT Community Center in New York City in '98 called Speak Out, and we dealt with the issues around contributing factors of addiction with LGBT folk, and also barriers to recovery. And it's complicated. We as a community, we have a higher rate of alcohol and drug use, and a higher rate of problems around alcohol and drug use. We also have a history of, the only place that we were allowed to congregate for years was in bars. So,
Right.
There's a very strong bar and club culture in a lot of LGBT society, but and I think that's changed, but I think it still is a very prominent thing that to be with queer people, you go and drink and party. So, and I don't have any judgment on that. I'm just saying if that's your place of gathering, then there's going to be a higher percentage of usage. That's just one factor, but it's an important one.
Right, absolutely. One of the things that Faces and Voices has been involved with, or has created, are sort of these public campaigns around recovery and advocacy for people who are in recovery. Can you talk about the content of some of those campaigns and what that has looked like?
Well, one of them is Recovery Voices Count, and that is to affect the electoral process and getting candidates to talk around issues around addiction and recovery. That's been around for a number of years, and we're revving that up now in this primary season. Another one is we've done a tremendous amount on rallies for recovery. Every September is Recovery Month, and just sort of public celebrations and rallies that hopefully will lead to some kind of community organizing or some kind of public policy work or bringing a certain issue to attention to the public. That's been a good vehicle for that. So those are just a couple of the things we've done. I'm trying to think of a couple of the others.
Well, I guess my question is, how successful do you think those campaigns have been, and what are you learning about how to make them more successful, and how do you even measure success in a campaign?
Well,
like this?
A couple of things. You know, I think they've been tremendously successful. I think that, like I said, in the 12, 13, 14 years I've been doing this work, I've seen an enormous change of A, people coming out, and B, attitudes, you know, slowly changing as the public becomes more educated about recovery. So I think it's a very powerful thing to see publicly people coming out and rallying at the state capitol, or having recovery picnics, or, you know, having social activities that don't involve the use of substances. Those are very powerful messages in terms of not only who we are and who we're becoming, but also that that everybody can have a good time without using. Like those are things that a lot of people, you know, they think, well, how could you have a fundraiser and not have booze? You have to lubricate people up so they'll pull their checkbooks out. Well, that's not, you know, that's just sort of an assumption that we've challenged, that that there's lots of ways of socializing and having fun that don't involve using drugs or alcohol.
Aren't there still some types of addiction, or some addictions that are more stigmatized than others? In other words, I mean, it's almost a social gathering, an AA meeting these days, and a lot of people could conceivably go to an AA meeting for other reasons. They may actually enjoy it, but there are some let's talk, you know, for instance, sex addiction. Don't you think that it's still a lot more difficult to be this kind of out and proud, celebratory person in recovery if what you're struggling with is something like sex addiction as opposed to alcoholism?
Well, I think sometimes we create hierarchies and pecking orders around all kinds of things, you know. So, you know, if anybody did sort of think that, you know, it was okay to drink but not okay to have a sex addiction, I would personally challenge that, because I think that all addictions come from the same sort of root, you know. And as in recovery, one thing you learn is that, you know, as you develop self-esteem and self-love, that you start, you know, sort of addressing some of those things that were, you know, you were filling up holes before, and you know, and you enter a healing process in recovery. So, you know, I mean, I think between, say, a heroin user or a meth user and an alcoholic, you know, that's complicated by public policy, because drugs are illegal in this country and alcohol, for at least for adults, isn't. And I don't want to get into that kind of discussion too much, but it does sort of temper the dialogue in terms of what kinds of substances or behaviors are socially acceptable, and you know, especially in social situations, and which ones aren't. So, you know, it's like everything you talk about becomes so complicated, because it's, you know, there's always this sort of a series of filters that we put on top of everything. But, you know, the bottom line is addiction's addiction, and if you're having a problem with addiction, you know, it wrecks your life. So, you know, it's so our job is like not so much to talk about, you know, which addiction is better or worse, but to help people get back on their feet so they can live productive lives and practice self-love.
I do think you're exactly right that the sort of cultural influences and policy influences that may lead to this sort of more or less stigmatization of certain types of addiction, you're right, that's a whole other discussion, a whole other show. But you talked about the fact that you have yourself more than 20 years of personal recovery and community organizing experience. And I imagine that at some point there was a decision process for you, as there has been for me, where you're sort of like, okay, I'm this person in recovery, I'm benefiting from this process. Now it's time for me to maybe transition into doing something a little bit more, advocating for it, or even in your case, making it my profession. Can you talk a little bit about that decision process, or the time when maybe you felt a calling to do that?
You got a couple hours? So I got sober in 1992 in New York City. I had been living in New York City for 12 years as a working artist, and that was what I thought I was supposed to be doing. And when I got sober, the words rigorous honesty sort of reverberated through my body, and I had been sort of conveniently out in certain areas, so I came out across the board to my family, to colleagues, professionally, and that was a very important thing to me. So I came out and got sober. The AIDS crisis was raging in New York City, and so as I learned, about the idea of giving back and doing service and things like that, I wanted to do it in a broader way because I saw so much happening, and I was coming across a lot of sober people that were doing a lot of very interesting things. So I worked with ACT UP and Queer Nation and Women's Health Action Mobilization, and so was doing these sort of things that were very activist oriented and about social change and social justice. And that just became really connected with my recovery. So as I came out across the board, I thought, well, if I'm disclosing my sexual orientation, why do I want to keep my recovery status a secret? It seemed like this great thing was happening, and I wanted that to be part of my whole message about who I was and who I was becoming. So it never, for me personally, it made sense to keep that a big secret. And I made a decision not to.
I want you to take a moment with me and let's envision a future, given that addiction is not going anywhere. Envision a future where an organization like Faces and Voices is no longer needed. Addiction is still around, but we've sort of advanced as a society where Faces and Voices work is done. What would that society look like in terms of its treatment of recovery and people in recovery?
Well, I think for me it would look like addiction and problems with addiction would be treated like any other kind of medical condition. That there would be no stigma and crossing a threshold to a care institution and asking for whatever kind of care you needed. That there would be, services and supports in place to get you back on your feet. That there wouldn't be barriers to housing and employment. That it would just be so status quo that, oh yeah, Beverly came in with a problem with drug addiction and alcoholism, and we're all going to help her, figure out how to sort of manage that and get back on with her life. And I think that sounds so boring and mundane, and at the same time just so comforting to me that there could actually be that kind of situation where you wouldn't be judged by a medical or social service professional. You wouldn't be judged by your family. It would be just is. It's the same as being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. It's like, you just get to the thing where it becomes a non-issue and it just is. And that's sort of my vision. If we could get to those sort of places in our society, that would be like a great achievement.
Well, here's to that future. Tom, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I've enjoyed it and learned a lot, and I hope you'll be back with us to talk about some of the other topics that we just had to.
Well, if you invite me, I'll come back, Heath. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Tom Hill is the program director of Faces and Voices in Recovery, a national organization on the front lines of the effort to destigmatize addiction and recovery in America. For more information, visit facesandvoicesofrecovery.org. More ahead on Recovery People. When we come back, we'll talk to the leader of an effort to bring recovery to Austin's deaf and hard of hearing community.
Recovery from substance use and co-occurring issues happens. and recovery-oriented housing can make all the difference. The Texas Recovery-Oriented Housing Network, or TRON, is a statewide coalition of housing providers dedicated to improving the availability and quality of housing for people with drug and alcohol issues. For more information or to donate to the cause, go to trohn.org, tron.org.
Norma A. is the chairperson of the Austin Deaf Access Committee, or ADAC. It's a group of AA members who have opened the doors to recovery for thousands of Austinites who are deaf or hard of hearing by providing sign language interpreters at AA meetings. We recently spoke with Norma about her work. So Norma, why don't you start out just by telling us a little bit more about the Austin Deaf Access Committee and sort of what you do?
The Austin Deaf Access Committee is a committee that was created to help people that are deaf and alcoholic, and it is part of AA. We provide interpreters, but we also provide fellowship for deaf alcoholics.
So it sounds like it's really about access. It's about helping people in the Austin community who are deaf and hard of hearing access recovery through 12-step meetings, but also you said you do sort of fellowship activities as well.
Right. We think that relationships are important and that coming to an AA meeting is helpful, but it's not everything. So we want to make sure that when we come into a meeting, a deaf alcoholic, like any other alcoholic there, also has a sponsor and friendship.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm just curious, what was it like in this community before this service was available? Because I've seen a lot of interpreters and a lot of people taking advantage of this service in our community, but what was it like before? Where did this particular sort of subset of addicts and alcoholics, how did they get recovery?
Well, the answer is they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And still, we are only a year old, and we are beginning to see more and more deaf people come into AA. And so we're hoping to see what I have heard about in other places in the United States where there are 80 deaf alcoholics and 4 interpreters at a meeting on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. And so, talk a little bit then about the genesis of this. How did it start? Was there just a group of you that in AA that were sort of particularly sensitive to this issue, or you knew some people who were deaf and needed to access recovery?
The way it came about is I have been working to help alcoholics who are in treatment centers as part of my AA service work. And one of the things that I would do is inform people in AA about who goes to treatment centers, how to go to a treatment center and carry the message effectively. And part of treatment center work included alcoholics who have special needs, and that would be blind people, people who are in wheelchairs, people who are homebound, people with disabilities, and deaf people. Now, our home groups, our AA groups, can take care of the needs of most special needs alcoholics. Everybody's special, but some of us have needs beyond, what is the norm. And we can give people who are blind rides. We can help people with disabilities read or provide them with tapes or CDs or MP3s. We can visit those who are homebound, but what about the alcoholic who is deaf? Mm-hmm. I found that they were being left out because of the need of an interpreter, the awkwardness of having to interact through an interpreter, and the financial burden. There's no such thing as 90 meetings in 90 days for a deaf alcoholic who is brand new.
Mm-hmm. And for our listeners who haven't maybe been to a 12-step where this service is provided, a 12-step meeting, what is it like? Is it awkward? How does it sort of work, and how does it flow, and how does do the people who are taking advantage of this service feel a part of the meetings, you think?
Well, as I said, we're new, so we're hoping they feel a part of.
I mean, sorry to interrupt, but I can't imagine. I mean, I know for most people, just accessing their first 12-step meeting without any special needs is terrifying. And to have this added, barrier, I would think that, it's just really tough for these folks.
You're right, it is tough. Anyone who is coming in new to AA, already they have a lot of problems, a lot of troubles, a lot of fears, and probably consequences from drinking. If you have also been isolated through deafness, and you maybe have not even heard anything about AA, because we who can hear, we're hearing things in conversation. If you're at a treatment center, you've heard everything that's been said, whether it was by a therapist, by a group, by a speaker, whereas a deaf person may only get an hour out of a 12-hour day of having an interpreter translate what's being said. We pick things up in school from some of the alcohol awareness programs, and may have some ideas about what AA is. We have an advantage to that degree. A deaf person doesn't have access to hardly any information on what AA is, what alcoholism is, or what to expect at an AA meeting. It's true. So one of the things that we hope to do is to provide that information through literature, through our website, and through the fellowship.
So Austin Deaf Access Committee, it's actually a committee of Alcoholics Anonymous, so it's a part of AA. But do you know at this point, is this service available for any of the other 12-step groups in town, or is Alcoholics Anonymous sort of the genesis of this here in Austin?
We are the genesis.
Mm-hmm.
This committee was formed, as I said, when I began doing work for people wanting to carry the message into treatment centers and looked at special needs alcoholics. I started researching if anyone else had been successful in helping deaf alcoholics. And I found a group of AA people in Portland, Oregon, and Salem, and California, and Washington, different places here and there, who had been asking AA groups to contribute some of their, what we call, seventh tradition funds. That's just that we put money in a basket to pay for our own expenses. And some of that money now goes to our committee so that we can pay for interpreters. And that's what these other places were doing.
It's interesting that the interpreters are actually paid for, and so they're not volunteers who come into the meeting. They're paid professional interpreters.
Right, because volunteers can not show up because they're not being paid. We feel it's important that we pay our way, and if this is an expense, a need, we're going to provide it, and we're going to make sure that no one goes to an AA meeting expecting to have an interpreter and then someone doesn't show up.
And so how does it work? The committee identifies a particular meeting where it may be good to have an interpreter, and then you go to that meeting and ask if they would divert some of their seventh tradition funds toward an interpreter, or what's the logistics of getting a particular meeting set up with this service?
Well, on our website, we have forms to fill out, and any deaf person can go and fill out a form and request a meeting. And that goes to our email services, and we look at that, and we find the interpreter, and we contact the deaf person within a reasonable amount of time and let them know that, yes, we have an interpreter. And on the website, it talks about the time commitment. We need a few days to make sure that, we can't do it in an hour. We have to have a little bit of notice. But all that information is kind of just almost electronic.
Mm-hmm. We keep talking about the website, and we'll certainly have a link to this on the Recovery People website, and we'll give it again at the end of the interview. But let's just go ahead and say it. What's the website that you keep mentioning? Where do people go?
It is austindac.org. That stands for Austin Deaf Access Committee.
So it's austindac.org.
Right.
You talked about some of the other cities. It sounded like a lot of cities on the West Coast maybe were kind of at the front of this movement. But it seems like Austin is also somewhat pioneering. Right, we're in a group of pretty early cities that are doing this. And I would imagine that not only the number of deaf and hard of hearing people that we see accessing this, but just the fact that it exists here in Austin so early is a reflection of the fact that we have the school here and everything. Is that accurate?
Well, as I said, this all came about through my service to carrying the message into treatment centers. I began looking at the fact that if you're an alcoholic and you're deaf, you're going to have a hard time getting to more than 1 or 2 meetings. The Travis County provides some services, but we're not connected with any outside agencies. No one else provides services to any other 12-step groups like NA, Narcotics Anonymous, or Al-Anon. They don't have services within their fellowship.
Back to the interpreters who are hired professional interpreters. So I'm guessing not all of them are going to be in recovery themselves. Maybe some of them are, but you certainly can't count on that. How do you handle sort of the issues around anonymity with the interpreters?
That's a good question, one that anyone would want to be concerned with, because anonymity, the fact that if I see you at a meeting, I'm not going to tell someone else you're there unless you give me that permission. We hire interpreters that are bound by a code of ethics. They know that anonymity is important, and some of the interpreters are not in AA, and they are given a contract and to sign, and this is typical of any interpreter type situation. There's lots of different ones out there, but for us, we're protected by that because they're professionals who, just like a doctor, a psychiatrist, a minister, they're bound also by a code not to reveal any type of information that would hurt someone.
Mm-hmm. And I know that sometimes in meetings, it can get pretty intense in there, some of the stuff that is shared. And I would imagine that probably most interpreters are used to, dealing with some pretty personal stuff on the part of their people they're interpreting for. But do you give the interpreters any kind of special training to prepare them for, like, look, this is an AA meeting, so you might be, translating some pretty intense stuff?
We're actually planning to do a workshop for interpreters to familiarize them with who and what we are, AA, and to help them understand more about the 12 steps, about recovery, about certain principles that are important to us, like singleness of purpose and anonymity and unity. And so we're doing what we can in that end. We also have material developed by AA that we give to interpreters so that they can interpret, for example, a chapter out of our book, Alcoholics Anonymous, called How It Works. It is interpreted exactly the same way by every interpreter if they have our service material toward that.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, I just think that this is wonderful and amazing, and it must be a revolution within the deaf and hard of hearing community to finally be able to access 12-step meetings, which are one of, but not the only way that people access and get recovery. And I'm just curious, in your experience through kind of creating this committee and being a part of it, what have you learned about the deaf community and some of the other maybe barriers that they face in terms of accessing recovery?
One of the barriers is language. I found out that American Sign Language is not English. It is a totally different language, conceptually, grammatically. I'm taking a sign language class now because I would like to be able to sponsor a deaf person without having to use a computer or some other means to clarify the language, vocabulary, and concepts. And what I'm learning is really helpful. Also, deaf people do not consider themselves disabled, just different. Mm-hmm. And they have an entire culture that is based on the use of sign language. And so these are things that are important to know when you want to relate or identify with a person of a different culture, just like we used to never have any Spanish-speaking people in AA because of the language and cultural differences. Now we have many, mm-hmm. and hopefully one day we'll have a totally deaf culture district.
Right. So I want to give the information one more time about where people can go to find information just about the committee in general, but also about specific meetings where these services are available. Where do people find information?
Mainly through the website, which is austindac.org.
We're talking with Norma A., who is spearheading an effort in Austin, Texas, to make 12-step meetings there more accessible to the deaf community. We'll continue our conversation when Recovery People returns. Stick around.
Soberhood is a 501c3 nonprofit decreasing the cost of addiction while improving the health and well-being of lives and communities through recovery support, awareness, and community building. For more information, go to soberhood.org.
Norma A. is the chair of the Austin Deaf Access Committee. So, Norma, can you talk a little bit more about some of your personal experience that sort of led you to get involved with this effort? What connection or affinity did you feel for this community that got you involved?
Well, one of the things that happened to me more than 30 years ago is I used to be involved in the deaf community, and I was fluent in sign language, and I was also drinking. And there were a lot of other people that, like me, were alcoholic, drinking, troubled, angry, all of what we call the spiritual malady. And today, I would like for people who are deaf to also have what I have now, which is a real freedom from all the things that made me drink.
We've talked a little bit about how fascinating and really this organic sort of growing and evolving creature that is American Sign Language. And a lot of people may think that it's just this word-for-word translation of English, which is not at all what it is. I'm interested if you can give us an example of sort of what I'm talking about in terms of how different the language of sign language is from English.
All right. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to read step 1, 2, and 3 out of the Alcoholics Anonymous book. In chapter 5 of How It Works, it lists our steps. In English, step 1 says, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. If you were to interpret that, it would be more like, we confess we have no power with alcohol, that we can't manage self-life. Step 2 came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. That's English. Interpreted, it might say, understood need to believe that a spiritual power bigger than self could give us again good thinking. Step 3. made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Translated or interpreted would be decided surrender our selfish ideas and lives to God, God as we understood God. You see the difference in the structure of the language? It's more like Cherokee or Chinese.
Huh. In that it's just very image sort of driven, or expand on what you just said a little bit.
I just read some words out of an AA service material that was developed so that everybody would be signing the same things. However, sign is really not a written language. It's a combination of signs, and it is visual.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Another thing I've heard you talk about that's really interesting is how certain, in the 12 steps we talk a lot about spiritual principles, and how certain of those principles can take on maybe a deeper meaning within the context of providing this service. Like unity, for example, is one that you described. Can you talk a little bit more about how concepts like unity may sort of become more poignant within this service?
When people come into AA, they come in with a lot of problems. And we say in the big book, it writes, we are restless, we are irritable, we are discontent. Basically, many of us come in disturbed, a lot of problems. And so we get help with that, and then we stop drinking. I think when a deaf person comes in, people assume that they are perhaps angry because they're deaf. And that's simply not true. They're just alcoholic, and they need the same help as any other new person in AA. So unity would mean that we want to stand together and look beyond anything that would stand in the way of us trying to carry the message to any alcoholic who comes in the door. So, I mean, you are somewhat known and recognized, I would think, in the AA community as a member of this specific committee. I wonder what kind of experience you've had, what response you've had from people in the deaf and hard of hearing community who have benefited from this service. One of the most important moments, I feel, was when we asked a deaf woman to speak at a large AA meeting. There were about 700 people there. A portion of the people who came to the meeting were all deaf alcoholics, and they were so grateful that our committee had made this possible. Afterwards, I was very moved because so many of them came up to me and expressed their gratitude. They said, "You've given us a voice. Thank you." And truly, it wasn't me, it was AA, through our service committees, through our organizations that are established so that we can help everyone and level the playing field, because we believe in AA that we are a fellowship of equals, and we want to try to bridge the gap between those that are hearing and those that are deaf. What was important, too, was that the alcoholics who could hear got to see the things that stood in the way of people who are deaf wanting to stay sober and not knowing how, and what we could do to help bring recovery to every alcoholic.
Well, I just can't tell you how much I personally appreciate what you're doing in the community, and I have really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Norma A. is the chair of the Austin Deaf Access Community, or ADAC, a group of AA members who bring sign language interpreters to meetings in Austin, Texas. For more information on that organization, you can visit their website at austindac.org. That's it for this episode of Recovery People. Be sure to join us next week. We'll talk with one of our nation's leading researchers on the party drug scene in America. We'll also take a look at the question of just how clean and sober you are if you're still using nicotine. Be sure to visit RecoveryPeople.org or our Facebook page for archives of the show. Recovery People is a production of Soberhood out of Austin, Texas. Thank you for joining us.